What's up, everyone? I have a very inexpensive country to share with you, and I have 4 specific investment ideas for you to consider, and you should really think about these if you're in the US, especially if you're an investor in the US, because the reality is a lot of markets, especially the US, are very expensive right now. US markets in general, on average, have a PE of about 30, and the country I'm going to share with you is Brazil, and they have a PE of about 5. So they're like 1/6 of the valuation. Now I could argue the US demands a higher premium, but this is a very large discrepancy in the valuations there. And I think in the coming years that investors that rotate into undervalued assets right now are going to do pretty well. So let's talk about Brazil for just a little bit, and then I'll share the 4 companies. Brazil is a country with 212 million people. It's a big country, and the average age there is around 34. So it's a country with a lot of people who are in their consumer and productive time of their life, meaning they're producing things, they're working, they're building companies, they're waking up early in the morning, going to work, and they are spending money. They're raising kids, they're buying vehicles, they're buying diapers, they're going out to dinner at night. And this is an economy that's very healthy from a demographic perspective. Now, a couple of decades from now, that's going to change. Their birth rate's around 1.6. So unless they start having a lot of babies, their average age is going to increase significantly as time goes on, and their economy will likely slow down unless they figure out how to implement robots and AI really well. But for right now, for the next several years, Brazil is going to be just fine just because of that average age that is consuming and producing things. The country itself is kind of removed from the rest of the world. They're in the south, in the global south. They're pretty far from India, from China, and even the US. So a lot of people forget about Brazil, but they are still very productive. The GDP of Brazil was around $2.1 trillion, so that's the projection for 2024. And next year, it's projected to be about the same. The GDP growth rate this year in 2024 is projected to be about 2.8, and next year it's going to be a little bit lower. That could change, however, if resource prices change significantly in the coming year, because their country's GDP is highly dependent on resource exports like oil, gas, gold, timber, all kinds of natural materials that come out of the earth. So let's jump to the companies that I think are interesting right now. The first one is Petrobras. The ticker is PBR. Most people know about this company. It's their big oil company within Brazil. The Brazilian government owns 50% of the company, so they are very much interested in the success of this company. It has a PE of about 5 and a yield right now of about 16%. That's pretty crazy for a valuation to be that low and a yield to be that high. Typically that's kind of alarming because that shows that they can't reinvest their money very well back into the company. But this is kind of one of those state-run companies, so it's kind of like an exception because the government wants that yield. They want that dividend that stock is paying off. So if you're an investor looking for an interesting situation, PBR, Petrobras, is an interesting situation. Another one is Vale, V-A-L-E is the ticker on US stock markets. Most people think it's Vale, it's actually pronounced Vale. And it is another oil company operating in Brazil. It has very similar metrics, a little bit smaller yield, but it's still very cheap. And if you want to sit in it for a while, you are going to get that dividend, or at least that has been the history over the past several years. All right, another company, ABEV, Ambev. It's their bottling company. They, produce all of the drinks and ship them around the country. It's one of those companies that's not going to go away, especially with a huge consumer base within Brazil. Their PE is around 12 with a 6% dividend. If you compare similar companies in the US right now, the US, similar companies like bottling and producing food and drinks and shipping around the country, US companies are way more expensive. And this is one other option. And then the last option is the easiest. It's the US ETF, or US-based ETF, EWZ, that's focused on Brazil. So this ETF holds a bunch of Brazilian equities. It charges about a 0.6% annual fee, but it does all the work for you. You don't have to go search for Brazilian stocks. This ETF does all the work for you, and it has a PE of 5 and a yield of 8%. So it's a pretty attractive opportunity right now. That said, over the past 5 years, that ETF is down about 35–40%. So its performance hasn't been that good. However, it could be bottoming right now just because it is undervalued, or it is extremely cheap compared to other markets, and especially compared to the US. So if you're an investor in the US right now, looking at your portfolio and looking how expensive a lot of your investments are, it might be a good idea to start selling and rotating into areas of the market that are very inexpensive, such as Brazil. Now, typically I look for some sort of catalyst, some sort of event that makes a change for an investment. And I can't really point to a specific catalyst with Brazil other than the fact that people have kind of forgotten about Brazil over the past several years. From an investing perspective, people are very focused on tech, they're focused on the US, and they're not really looking at international markets, and they're not really looking at Brazil. And that has caused the Brazilian equities in general to get really, really cheap. So there's no real catalyst other than people have kind of forgotten about the opportunity in Brazil. There are two things that happened in the past week that are somewhat notable that I think investors should know. The first one is that Xi Jinping met with the president of Brazil, Lula, and they discussed strengthening their relationship. So basically, China wants to be able to export a lot of their vehicles, electronics to Brazil, and they want to take a lot of their resources from Brazil and import them into China. And Lula and Xi are very pro making that relationship work. They are already working together, but they want to strengthen it even more. The second thing that happened was Modi from India also met with Lula this past week, and they had almost the identical meeting, which is India wants to strengthen ties with Brazil for almost the same reasons. India wants to get a lot of the resources out of Brazil into India for manufacturing, and India wants to export a lot of the things they manufacture into Brazil. Typical geopolitical trade discussions that would be normal under any other circumstance, except for the fact that it's China and India, which are somewhat challenging US for, I just stepped on a thorn, for US, for world influence. Anyway, it's important to understand that that's happening, especially from a US perspective, because it shows that Brazil is starting to branch out and do bigger deals with countries that are growing more and more. And again, it's not necessarily a catalyst, but it is a reason to be somewhat bullish for the next several years for Brazil, especially with the valuation that the country holds right now. All right, so that's a good idea for you if you're sitting on huge gains in the US to rotate into, and it's hard to stomach that decision right now. It's hard to give up the idea that we're gonna see more and more and more, but this is the time to be very disciplined, patient, and look at the numbers, look at the valuations, and look at your options, and consider taking some of your profits off the table and putting them to undervalued areas of the market. All right, guys, I'm gonna enjoy the rest of this kind of stormy walk. Beautiful out though. All right, see ya.